afterwards.
Okay, cool. So this chapter I'm about to read from is chapter 5. It's called Middle England, based in Birmingham, and we, I guess, first introduce one of the main people who runs through the spine of the book, Ryan, as he's known, or Desper, as he's known to others. But this is, I guess, looks at the kind of creative non-fiction approach I was talking about, but also looks at his introductions into music and some of the personal things that were going on in his life that kind of led him to that point. I've had a few events where I realised there were like young people in the audience, and there is some swearing in it, so I hope everyone is okay with that. But chapter 5, Middle England. When his granddad passed in 2001, Ryan was 18 and a fuck up. He was selling weed, he was debt collecting, he was fighting. He was a good-hearted boy, lost to a time and a place that demanded a stone-faced camouflage from its young. This is Darlaston, a small town on the edges of Walsall, an old coal town, a steel town, a blitz survival story. In the decades to come, he would scratch the place from memory, an era best buried, the sufferings in a shallow grave. But it's the early millennium now, and he's 18, still here, where he has always been. He's living with his mum, his grandparents live in a house across the road. This is all that he knows. Darlaston is black country, the region in the far north of the West Midlands, loosely defined in the 1800s, when black smoke from the many ironworks stained the horizon with an eternal fog. Here, as he was coming of age, along the ruins of these once booming industrial heartlands, towns like Darlaston were withering, smoke fading to dust, dust holding the ghosts of what once was. His generation were birthed in the ashes. They inherited a home where the population was falling, where unemployment was high, where expectations were low, and, as Ryan says, almost nobody escapes. A home where the education system was flawed, where you left school to work, as he says, at the packing plant down the road, to work in retail, to work in a bar, to work in the Big Asda. Or, if you're him, you sell weed. You work at Burger King for a year, you work at the packing place for a few weeks, filling and moving boxes, then quit. You sell some ecstasy pills, you sell coke for a month, you spend your savings on a music studio and jelly babies in an era when UK garage was the sound of the time, and something darker was ready to take its place. You live your days as your town and your generation is determined. You've done so for years now already. In this time period, music was a saviour. Music had never left him. Music was there when he was 14 and dreaming of sound, of someday owning a successful record label, walking the road paved by the likes of Eazy-E and Master P. Music was there when he started out as a producer, saving his coins and notes to build his own studio. It was there when he first picked up a microphone to MC, and when it wasn't, like the early stint in the packing factory at 16, where they told him no headphones during shifts, he quit and found his way back to rap. Music was there in the darkest of his days, when his granddad passed and his brothers passed and the family withered. In that period, the raps he recorded were angry, pain vibrations echoing out into a lonely world, relieving the tension in his chest. Music was his rock, a constant glimmer in a fading night, the lighthouse beam at dead dawn. It saved him and an entire generation growing up in dark times.
They tried to tell me no headphones when I was filing medical records at the hospital. We showed them, didn't we? So it's amazing the way that you've captured the stories of people like Desper, these pioneers who've gone on to pave the way for so many pivotal acts in places like Birmingham, and how did you forge these relationships with these people? Because that doesn't come from nowhere. So what is your just Desper, for example? How did you end up meeting him and getting him to tell you his story?
So a lot of the relationships came with the book. I dig him first, and then a lot of it then filtered down from there. So the book is set in 3 places: the West Midlands, South Wales, and South London. And essentially, what I wanted to do was to look at the reality of the music and trace a history, a social history of the music over generations from the 60s to present day, and in some places further back than that. But then what I really wanted to do was look at the impact that music is having on people's individual day-to-day lives. So to showcase that the legacy of the music was maybe bigger than, I guess, the popularity that we see of people headlining big festivals and being in magazine covers and being in adverts, which all of that, those signposts of success are great, but I really was interested in exploring how does music affect our day-to-day life on a really personal and really local level. And so when I set out with that intention, my aim was then to try and meet people whose stories I feel like reflected that. And I think through the journalism work I've been doing, I'd started to hear those kind of stories already, and I'd started to see it in different places up and down the country. So I was then really interested in exploring that on a national scale. So somebody like Despa or Ryan, who I just read about, I'd known him for maybe 2 years before that, and we'd had like really interesting conversations about his life story, about music in Warsaw and then music in Birmingham. And then I approached him and said, look, I would love to interview you and tell your story widely as part of this book, and then drill down into your personal history, but using that personal history to tell a local history, and then by telling all of these different local histories to then tell like a more national story as well. So that was kind of the top-down process of it as well.
Yeah, a lot of it is very relatable. A lot of his experiences, anyone reading that who either has aspirations now to do something greater or something in music, or someone who's already there, there's something in there, like those jobs you don't like, and the way that you tell his story in terms of how he ended up just getting over and getting those wheels in motion. Another area of the book that is fascinating, I had no idea about this, is the South Wales. So what's the story there? How did you come across this? Like, how did you even find out about this history that is, seemingly overlooked?
Yeah, so the South Wales section kind of centres around a band, a former band called Asteroid Boys, and there were about 6 of them, but there were 3 main members, Phil, Del and Benji. And when I was starting to plan the book, I was like, if I really want to tell a national story, I have to leave England as part of that. And so I started exploring stories in different areas, like I went to Scotland briefly, and then I started going across, and then I dropped Phil, one of the guys in Asteroid Boys, an email randomly. I'd heard of the music before, but I wasn't over familiar with it. So I just emailed him one day, like, look, I'm writing this book, I'd love to come across to Cardiff one day and spend some time with you. And I didn't know too much about the history of music or the history of community in South Wales at the time, but it was a real like baptism in how deep and how long that history does stretch back for. And I think the first day I met him, we spent I think 7 hours together, and he was just driving me around Cardiff and then kind of showcasing all of this history to me about the history of immigration from the docks, because it's a port city, so they've had history of migration for like 100 years now. So people that come from the Caribbean, people that come from Africa, people that come from mainland Europe, from Greece, where Phil's family were from. And hearing those stories, I thought, okay, there's definitely a wider story here to tell than just maybe about the band and him itself, but one that links their the current genesis of the music back to the communities that actually arrived and settled in Cardiff in that time period. So a lot of it was, especially with these kind of books, and as I was talking about like the kind of creative non-fiction element of it, is that though there is the fictional element, there is like a really big research and interview part of it. So once I met Phil, you'd kind of meet him, and then he'd maybe say, oh, you should speak to this person, you should speak to that person, and slowly you get introduced to like the wider community at large. But Wales was fascinating. I always remember there was someone I interviewed who started the Newtown Carnival, which is essentially their version of Notting Hill Carnival. And he was showing me pictures of, he came from Barbados. He has Bayesian heritage, but his family, his great-granddad had come to the UK in 1903, I think, or something like that. And then he was showing me like his great-granddad's wedding pictures, essentially. It was like 1903 or 1904. And he was like a guy from Barbados, but then his groomsman was from Somalia, another one from Nigeria. And I didn't know that black history in the UK in a contemporary sense stretched back that far. And so that was like really eye-opening for me in terms of even just reimagining what I'd thought that I'd already knew about like the history of communities in this country. So I think it became like a really important section to include in the story, because I think sometimes, maybe because it is in a different country, it isn't necessarily folded into like the wider history you hear when people talk about the history of black communities in the UK. But I think it's a really important place, and I think it also reflects other places like Liverpool and all of these other places that have that similar port history too.
I was just going to say, it's fascinating to hear about the Wales connection and how you did your research. I don't know whether it's because you've told us or you've told me that you were approaching Wales from almost like a distance. You were going there to learn. The London, the South, that writing, I sense a little bit of closeness. The way that you wrote about that, it felt a little bit more familiar, far more personal. Is there anything you can talk about on that level? Having that inside information, did that change the way that you wrote about the artists that you addressed from London?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I was born in Lewisham Hospital, which is in South London. Then I was raised in Bromley. So I feel like a lot of the musicians I was talking about in South London I've been listening to for 20 years or so. And I think there's a really interesting thing with writing in that you may be researching for a specific book, whether it's fiction, non-fiction, but there are certain things that there's certain knowledge that you've just carried with you over the years and through your experiences that may then just find its way into a book. So I feel like there were, in the South London section particularly, there were a lot of moments it may have been a line or two lines, but that was a product of me having lived with that music for like 2 decades, if that makes sense. So I think one of the early chapters is about So Solid Crew, and that was like my first exposition to music outside of the house, if that makes sense. So I remember being like 8 or 9 years old and standing outside and just hearing like cars just playing 21 seconds as they're driving past consistently, before it even had a music video or before it was on TV. It was just something that just existed in the local area. Then one day you turn on the TV and they were on TV too. So I think that was like my first exposition to like British music in a way. So I feel like those experiences and those moments made their way into the book, though I'd lived with them for a long time. If that makes sense.
So that was happening outside the house. What was happening inside the house? What kind of music was going on there?
Very musical household growing up. So my dad is from Nigeria, my mum's from Cameroon, and my dad would play he came to London in the 80s and had like a real love for music. So growing up I would hear like a lot of high life, like Nigerian high life, Ghanaian high life, but then he would play like a lot of soca and calypso and a lot of reggae as well. So there was this exposition to all of these genres where people are really telling either stories through sound or they're telling actual stories through lyrics and that kind of thing. So that was like a lot of the music I remember growing up listening to and just floating around in the house at the time. And then I think as you get slightly older, you start to develop like your own interest in music. So there was like So Solid, as I was talking about, but like even stuff like Channel U, growing up, finally watching Channel U and watching a lot of those old videos.
Sorry to interrupt again. I was just going to ask, in relation to So Solid, were you aware it was lesser known, but groups around the Midlands? There's a group from Nottingham around about the time of So Solid called Out the Ville, who were at that point, they were being played on they were being played on MTV Base and they were on Channel U and things like that. I know that you were young, but did that kind of Midlands essence reach you where you were growing up?
I wouldn't say at the time, probably not when I was like 9, 10. I think, which is probably a big difference between how music is consumed then and now. Whereas then it was like, unless you had direct access to it, it was hard to understand what was going on elsewhere, or unless it was on the national radio or on TV and stuff like that. It was hard to see. And so I was just hearing the music that was like happening in the local surroundings or happening in my house or happening when I'm going to, I don't know, family gatherings and functions, and then later going out with friends and stuff like that. So it's like a lot of it was very local. I think even in London it was very local. There are a lot of musicians that I know their full history of, but then I speak to a friend from Southwest London or a friend from North London and they have like no clue of that time period, if that makes sense, and vice versa. So I feel like those time periods were almost like really small, like alternate local histories in a way where you could really hear what was going on in a specific community through a specific few artists. I think it was only as I got older and as I started doing the book where I'd actually start to hear about who were the musicians in other parts of the UK who were representing what some of these musicians I was listening to were at the same time, which I think is the really beautiful thing about the genres, is that scale and how easy access it was for people to pick up the genres, but then the record and the mark that they leave once they've done so, and that everybody then has their attachment to that time, place that is recorded and documented in history, but that people have the attachment to the musicians as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, just hearing what you were talking about, the idea of UK rap, when I read your text, when I read the book, your idea of UK rap is almost the opposite of me, because I would say I'm a little bit older than you, I'm guessing. And so my era of UK rap had different names. You touched upon it at the beginning of the text, like with Rodney P and the London Posse and Cookie Crew and Moni Love, etc. But yeah, it's just an interesting one. You know, everybody's perspective is going to be different. You know, where I'm from, I have different ideas of even the term UK rap. I don't know, because I guess it's something to do with your age and the location. I suppose there are eras that kind of go by that aren't addressed. I suppose, you know, I suppose that's only right in some ways. You can't go and do a lot of digging. You know, you want to be able to speak upon what you're passionate about and what, you know, the music that you've grown up with, I guess.
Yeah, it was a mix. I think with writing in general, and especially with non-fiction, I think I set out to tell like quite a specific story, but I knew that I feel like when you try and capture too much, you sometimes end up capturing nothing in that sense, or not with enough depth. So I knew like if I was quite specific, I'd be able to capture something like quite uniquely rich, and then by doing that, hopefully there's a universal element to some of the stories that are captured within that, because even as I said with the 3 regions I've covered, as I've gone across the UK this year, people have always asked like, what about Bristol, or what about Brighton? So I've had a lot of that, but I would always say that if I was like, and I think I say it in the introduction, that this isn't like an exhaustive history of UK rap and these genres, this is specific to these people and specific to these places, because I think I'd probably still be writing the book now if I tried to do the whole country. And then as you were saying about the different terms, that was something I was definitely very aware of, so, which is why I was specifically saying UK rap, because of course there's like UK hip hop, then there are all of these different subgenres of the sound, if that makes sense, but some of them I feel like had different cultural roots and connections. So I found that the music that I was growing up with, I feel like when I think about a lot of the musicians, a lot of their roots would go back to like sound systems and whatnot, and it would almost go beyond rap into like dancehall, and then beyond that into like ragga and stuff like that. So I was interested in tracing like those lineages between these different generational sounds that ultimately stem back to, as you were saying, the South London people like Smiley culture and whatnot. Like I was really interested in tracing like that genealogy of music, but what does that look like on a local level, almost passed from family to family, like grandson to son.
It definitely ties into what you're writing about with pirate radio in the book as well. Could you touch on what you discovered when you were researching like the pirate radio scenes in like Birmingham and London and stuff?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think there was kind of running in the background of the book, I knew there were like 3 foundational elements I wanted to talk about in regards to grime and UK rap. So one was youth clubs, which kind of shows up in the South Wales section. In the South London section, it was about kind of old school DVDs and that kind of thing, like pirate radio DVDs that people, like young kids were just recording on like cheap camcorders and
Risky
filming
Roads and all
Risky
that.
Roads and whatnot. And then the third element was pirate radio, which kind of dominates the West Midlands introduction. And I was interested in that because a lot of the MCs and artists I grew up listening to all had their start on pirate radio in that era. But then I was quite interested in what does pirate radio actually look like on a community level. So in Birmingham, there was this station called PCRL, which stood for People's Community Radio Link. And essentially I found that a lot of the artists I would talk to, they would say they would listen to that station growing up. And essentially it was started by a guy called Cecil Morris, who came to the UK in the 50s, I believe, came from Jamaica. And he, in the midst of the first Handsworth riots in 1981 or so, people in the community started realising there was nowhere to go and hear like their actual music. So there was nowhere to hear reggae, there was nowhere to hear these sounds. And there were 2 commercial radio stations at the time, the BBC West Midlands, and then the BRNB, which I think has turned into Capital or something like that now. And he went to them, and him and a bunch of DJs went to them and said, look, like, can we get a show? There's nowhere playing our music, there's a huge population of us here, but there's nowhere actual access to hear the sounds that we love. And they kind of got laughed out of the building, he said. They kind of told them, like, there's a show on Sunday, and they have like a South Asian presenter, and he plays like every 2 weeks, he might play like a reggae song every now and then, so you should kind of be happy with that. And he kind of put the battery in his back to just start his own radio station. So he went back to his flat, set up his own pirate station, and started just playing music out into the community, and that was the birth of PCRL. It was a really, like, I think he has such a powerful story of, I think, resistance, because as he started to play music out into the community, people would start to come to him and say, oh no, we actually need more of this. Can you start doing programming? Can you program different shows and different stations? And he started to do that, and each station began to grow. They eventually got a studio. Once they got a studio, he started to bring in train like young people who wanted to be DJs and presenters, and they started then to do talk shows about what's happening in the community. They started to invite different members, maybe like South Asian heritage to come on the show too, to come on the station too. And the station got so big that I think he was saying one day eventually, like, I think the BBC looked at their listening figures in West Midlands and like, why is our listenership kind of dropping? Like, what's going on here? And it turned out that people were just tuning in to BCRL because of it was actually catering to the actual local community and what that looked like as a demographic. After that, it gets into like a big battle with the DTI, who are essentially the element of the government who are essentially charged with taking pirate radio stations down. So he ends up in a long game of cat and mouse. It goes maybe over like 15, 20 years almost, and they would raid him in the morning, take down the station, sometimes wreck the material, and then by the afternoon he'd be back up somewhere else. And I think he got raided over 500 times essentially over the course of that time period, and every time he would set up again, people in the local community would help him out. If there was like a janitor and like who was looking after a specific council estate, he would say, oh, here's the keys, there's like an empty flat on this floor, you can go and set up in there. And it kind of became like a real community effort as well. And one thing that always stood out to me was he would say that when, say, somebody passed away in the community, they'd broadcast it on the station and say, look, this is when the funeral is. If this person has family in West Bromwich or in Walsall and they can't necessarily reach them, they broadcast it on the station so people would know when to come and when to arrive. And I think so it came a lot more than just about music itself, but really about the community. And then as I started interviewing a lot of the prolific musicians from Birmingham, who were grime MCs and rappers, I'd say, did you listen to this station? And they'd all say like, yeah, no, my auntie used to listen to it, I'd ride around with her in the car, or my granddad used to listen to it, I remember listening to it with him, or my dad would listen to it in the house. And I was like, oh, so this kind of set a real foundation for all of these MCs who would graduate to making pirate radio stations themselves. So I think it was really important to include that story, because I think it really shows essentially what I was talking about, the role that music plays in a specific space and how it actually directly impacts the lives of those people involved, but then also the people around them too, and then has a legacy that then continues to this day in a lot of ways.
That's astonishing. I think, wasn't it one of the places he put one of the areas that was like right opposite the police station?
Yeah. So I think the DTI in central Birmingham, they had a big office there, and they were looking for him, and they couldn't find him, and he was broadcasting from right across the road. So yeah, very interesting man. He told me a lot of stories that some of them didn't get to make the book, about learning how to essentially pirate the TV stations after they'd. So at that time, the TV stations would go off air at, I guess, 8 PM or something like that, when you had like the traditional 5 channels. And he told me about, they found a way to, when 8 PM came, maybe 9 PM, him and his friends would go there, and they managed to pirate the TV. So they'd say, oh, like, turn on the TV at 10 PM. They'd tell everyone in the area, they'd turn on the TV, and then there'd be like some classic black film playing that they just decided to program. So they're like, very ingenious guy. But then I think also the big thing that stood out for it was that people not necessarily doing that for monetary gain. I think that was such a big part of it, that it was a real labour of love in that sense, or at least that was the motivation of it.
It was better if they didn't know who you were.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're not broadcasting your face like, it's me doing this, me doing this.
It kind of makes me think, you talked about engaging in this battle. Cecil Morris eventually engaged in this battle when it became like a communal thing of appreciation. It's maybe it's a sign of the times that nobody from an organisation like the BBC or Capital or whatever it was realised the potential and the impact, and realised the ingenuity of the person, and decided to try and take them on board. Instead, it became a battle between authorities and this idea of piracy, when there was a
not necessary conflict that could have been fruitful from the get-go for everyone.
100%. I feel like a big legacy of the music is that idea of creating something from nothing. I think you see that with Cecil Morris sitting there with the pirate radio stations, then you see it in a lot of the musicians that came afterwards. You see it with Ryan's story, who's the beginning of his story that I read out, like that was a concurrent theme throughout all of these stories, was, I guess, lack of infrastructure and lack of support from wider institutions. and to people having to go out and cast off and start to make the music by themselves. I guess like grime and hip hop are both products of that in their own specific ways. Like in America, hip hop was the music programs getting cleaved in all of these schools across New York, and then people essentially taking the music back to the community and creating stuff that way. I think grime, similar, people starting off with making instrumentals on like PlayStations and PCs and whatnot. So I feel like that element of DIY, I think, has run through a lot of these genres from beginning to end.
So, sorry, Becky was trying to tell me something there.
Would you like to take any questions from the audience?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Anyone have any questions?